This Late Night Linux Family podcast is made possible by our patrons. Go to latenightlinux.com/support for details of how you can join them. Support us on Patreon for access to ad-free episodes and early releases. That's latenightlinux.com/support.
Hybrid Cloud Show, episode 49. I'm Aaron.
I'm Gary.
I'm Sean.
And I'm Shane.
Welcome to the show about public cloud, private cloud, and everything in between. Our views here are ours, and not those of our employers. I was reading a post today about the idea of European hyperscalers, and it made me think more generally about some of the moves in the market around Amazon's EU region, some of the other pieces that are happening in that space. And so I wanted to have a chat around the idea of big clouds coming out of the EU and how that fits into the market and what we think should and does exist.
So is it helpful to first clarify what the hyperscaler that has entered the EU sovereign market is and has done?
Yeah, please take us through it.
So AWS have recently partnered with the EU to introduce the European Sovereign Cloud, which is an AWS region based out of Germany that is only operated and run by staff in the EU. So think of this as the EU's equivalent of GovCloud or AWS China.
So does this mean they actually host the control planes in the EU instead of somewhere else this time?
My understanding is yes, that this is much like AWS China, a completely separate AWS instance. So it has its own control plane. All of the staff are based out of the EU, and none of the usual AWS support staff, solutions architects, TAMs, all the rest of it have access to data in the EU Sovereign Cloud unless they are part of the AWS EU Sovereign Cloud org.
Okay. All right. I'm interested. I'll bite. Now tell me why I don't want this.
Well, Amazon is still an American company and still remains the parent organization of EU Sovereign Cloud, is my understanding. So it might not be quite as sovereign as perhaps we're being led to believe.
I think it really depends on what your use case is. If you're trying to get around EU regulation and need some tick boxes filled in a form for some compliance person, I think this will be just what you need.
Yeah, I think I agree with you, Shane. If you need to meet some kind of EU regulation to say that your service is only hosted in the EU and only people who are physically located in the EU can touch it, this is exactly what you need. It's the same with certain companies I've worked with in the past have this for the US, where they wanted guarantees that only people adminning the servers were US citizens on US soil, and it leads to all sorts of problems.
I think considering the political climate we're in, there is probably people who might look at this solution and think that this could be a solution to some of the geopolitical challenges going on right now. How do people feel about that?
Sean, you're the token American in the group. What do you think?
I tried so hard to avoid it. Man, I mean, why wasn't this done like 15 years ago? Yeah, I totally understand the over-reliance on American technology. I mean, that's America's main export, whether people want to believe it or not. Technology is the main export of America, and for better or worse, the rest of the world really depends on America for its technology. Now, there are definitely different places, different niches where things come in and out. Like, for example, instead of everybody relying on WhatsApp in China, we have WeChat. In different places, you can use either WhatsApp or Signal for official business, purposes. I'm hoping to see some more stuff like that where we can get away from, even AWS EU, like you said, America is still the parent company. If Amazon folds because the dollar goes weak and, whatever economy drop happens, then what's AWS European Sovereign Cloud going to do? If the EU had, maybe taken a more aggressive approach on trying to do this 15 years ago, we might be in a different place. I recognize that is very easy for me to say, and we're dealing with, one country, one economy versus 28 or 27. I don't know. You guys have to tell me. I'm not from the EU, but easy to say, much harder to do. But I'm glad something's finally happening. I don't know if another hyperscaler is the answer though, versus something. And this is again, very open source to me, very FOSS, very Linux, but more of a federated approach.
What concerns me about believing that this could be any solution to sort of geopolitical insulation is that, to take the analogy of NVIDIA right now, they have complied with local markets in China. They've built Chinese-specific chips. They've adjusted performance characteristics in those chips and sold legitimately in that country, following their local laws. None of that really mattered once US export controls were applied due to the current administration. So US policy still overrode local demand, local compliance, etc. So if you feel that that may be a risk you could be affected by in AWS in the future, then I don't think this insulates you from that. And it may not be that AWS is pulled from the EU market, but it may be if you want access to specific chips or something else, or they decide that they're going to tariff this thing. I don't think this protects you from that risk. So those are the things that I think people need to be aware of when they consider this as a solution to protect themselves. Because I worry that the timing of this coming out in this geopolitical climate implies it protects from that, but it doesn't.
Yeah, and I think the other thing that concerns me is the org structure around this, and there might be a bunch of AWS people sitting here screaming at their headphones saying that we're wrong. But the fact that there is an American parent company, and therefore ultimately this is going to be beholden to whatever demands certain US departments may make, concerns me as well. It's only so sovereign as to be a completely separate org. But if, I don't know, the DoD or whatever come in and say, we want access to this data, and it's a company you own, I don't know how much restriction there is on that. And that concerns me as well. You know, it doesn't seem isolated enough. And definitely this isn't what I had in mind when the Sovereign Cloud Initiative was announced a couple of years ago. I thought it would be something that was much more localized and had nothing to do with any of the big hyperscalers. And I'm sort of disappointed that it's turned out this way through conversations or whatever it might be, that it's just being delivered by the same company that everyone was using anyway.
Yeah, this is disappointing. This is like the least AWS needed to do. I know it's probably a ton of work to do, but this does feel like not really a very natural divestment from the company as a whole.
And in researching, like, this is super handicapped. It's not even the full AWS cloud. Like, congratulations, you got the knockoff.
Yeah, but I mean, all regions launch like this with a small subset of services, and they're not going to go and put some of the older services in the new regions. They're not going to put the old chips in the new regions.
Well, AWS has the infrastructure, US has the economy. Like, we can make data centers as fast as we can make McDonald's. It's no problem. I don't think the EU has that capability, or does it? You tell me.
I don't know, but I'd certainly expected much more investment than, hey, Amazon, come build this for us.
Like most of these questions, you have to ask yourself what problem you're trying to solve when you look at an initiative like this. And I think you're right, Shane. There are going to be some people who look at this and say it ticks the box and they get all of the benefits of normal AWS, but they get that with some operational control in the EU. If that meets your requirement, then great. It raises that wider question of whether, well, firstly, is something like an EU hyperscaler something we want to see? Is this idea that you mentioned, Sean, of a federated hyperscaler really a thing that could exist? And what are the compromises that we've already talked about countless times of moving away from those hyperscalers and the control planes and APIs and tooling that we all know to really support little local clouds in the EU or anywhere else growing up into competitive offerings that people can use in alternative to the big hyperscalers?
Well, I think this is a big part of the problem, is that these hyperscalers have put so much investment into building new services, building APIs that work cross-region, cross-instance of the hyperscaler cloud, that companies are really tied in terms of orchestration. Even if they followed all of the best practice in terms of building loosely coupled applications built on open source technologies, there's a lot of reorchestration to do to tick that compliance checkbox. So I think you're right. If their thing is to tick a compliance checkbox and they can just reuse the Terraform they've already got, but change the region string they're deploying to, that makes this really easy. I think if you really want something that is truly EU sovereign, this isn't the thing for you. Equally, I'm not sure that any of the smaller European clouds could build something of this scale with this level of service availability, because they just don't have the dollars backing them in terms of R&D budget to build some of those services.
Well, I think, like Shane said, surely with this geopolitical climate, we've now diverted some investments to these clouds, right? Right?
Yeah, we definitely haven't just thrown it all at Amazon to build the EU Sovereign Cloud DE East 1.
This episode is sponsored by Antigravity. Go to hybridcloudshow.com/A1drone. The Antigravity A1 is the first drone to deliver genuine, all-in-one 8K 360-degree video capture in a single unit. Built to be exceptionally easy for beginners to use, it still offers the performance needed to capture breathtaking 8K spherical footage, powered by the same imaging technology used in Insta360 cameras. By recording in every direction simultaneously, it captures all angles at once, giving you complete creative control during post-production. You can reframe your shots, apply dynamic cinematic movements, and shape your video exactly as you envision it. Sophisticated 360-degree stitching technology seamlessly removes the drone from your final footage. The A1 also comes with vision goggles that provide a live, real-time 360-degree view from the drone. OmniLink transmission ensures the video feed remains smooth, stable, and ultra-low latency. With the SkyPath system, you can accurately map and control the A1's flight path. Routes can be planned, saved, and automated, allowing the drone to fly autonomously while you concentrate on capturing the scene or directing the perfect shot. The Antigravity A1 is a real game changer. You get full immersive flight with the goggles, intuitive controls, and endless creative freedom in editing. If you're thinking about buying a drone, make it this one. Check out the link in the show notes to learn more.
This is where, like, maybe Sean's sort of federated cloud might come in. Like, if we treated infrastructure as like a last mile provider and had open standards across that, where people are, okay, it's very kumbaya utopia here, but like everyone was contributing to the same open standards. And so you've got your distributed set of, like, let's say smaller cloud providers just providing things like price, latency, location, etc., like the fundamentals of compute, and the actual control plane on top of it was something like a Kubernetes, something, you know, more open. Would that be a way that Europe could compete?
Potentially, but then I kind of back my slightly pessimistic question back at you. Where's the marketing budget come from for this? It's a really difficult problem to solve, because you could build Kubernetes with some kind of cross-plane and deploy open source technologies on top of it. And any of us could do that. It's not a hard problem to solve, right? The infrastructure is almost open enough at this point that you could, in theory, deploy across Hetzner and OVH and a bunch of others with crossplane. And you could do your orchestration on top of that if you really needed to. And that could include EU Sovereign Cloud. I think the problem comes when you've already built using Cloud WAN and CloudTrail and all of these other AWS native services that is really hard to back your way out of.
So in researching for this recording, I did actually see something called Gaia X, which was an initiative for this kind of federated kind of last mile piece. But if you look at the website, it seems to be a lot of corporate talk yet. I haven't seen anything really out there. They're talking about leadership signaling.
Looks European, all right.
Yeah, I mean, I'm seeing lots about committees and working groups and documentation. I'm not seeing very much code or any examples here.
Remember when Stripe on the homepage had like just literally like a curl command for like get up and running? This is the opposite of that. This is like, I'm going to have to read 12 white papers to know what the hell I'm actually trying to buy here.
I mean, benefits of Gaia X. Gaia X provides you with access to a broad network of potential clients and partners, expanding your market reach. Now, this doesn't sound like a sovereign cloud product at all.
Okay, let's again pretend that it's not Europe. I want to talk a little maybe about the Chinese EV market, right? What they did was they gave massive subsidies and tax write-offs to a bunch of manufacturers and buyers. There was a really low barrier for entry to become an EV startup. A ton of them shared a lot of infrastructure around charging standards, battery supply chains. What that did was an incredibly brutal competition where effectively a couple of winners came out of that, but it was an incredibly competitive market that built up, essentially. It almost became like a infrastructure rather than a product category. And you see the benefits of that now. I just wish Europe could do something similar. Like, I don't know. This is just so depressing.
Yeah, I mean, it feels like it's really been a race to the bottom to build a minimum viable sovereign tech product, right? And I quite like that idea. If you'd said to the existing European cloud providers, we want you to build something that rivals AWS that is truly European, and you have to pay no tax, and here are some subsidies. I think you probably could have got something a lot better than those providers currently have. I'm still not convinced you'd have got something as good as AWS, though.
Yes. The answer is yes. You probably would not have, because just like Apple's and AWS's, with the vertical integration control that you get from being one company, you get to move quick, you get to have a lot of control and push efforts for crazy things in a way that would take years to do across multiple countries, multiple companies. But I think it's worth it.
Oh, yeah, no, I'm playing devil's advocate slightly. I do think it would absolutely be worth having a slightly jankier thing that was genuinely sovereign than what we've ended up with. It might be a pain to deploy on now, but equally, I think those constraints would breed some creativity, and people would very quickly start building cool new stuff for whatever sovereign cloud we might have ended up with. And maybe it would have meant that people were less dependent on the technologies the hyperscalers provide. Because let's face it, it's not just AWS. There will be a Microsoft one. There will be an Oracle one. Maybe there will even be a GCP one. I think these other companies are going to see that there is a market for this, and they're going to want a slice of that pie sooner or later. I just wish that we'd at least given the actual European companies a chance to get there first.
So how would you do this if you were approaching this as a sort of technologist? I mean, I take your point on the sort of committees trying to create clouds, but if we assume that it's possible to build up all of these higher level operations and all the way up to serverless or whatever with tooling, and we've got all the message queues, you can do all the PASI type stuff on top when you're doing all of Shane's platform engineering kind of work on top of existing stuff, then could we get to a point where a provider just needed to provide virtual machines and everything else above that was, for example, standardized, and you could communicate with that in a standard way through your normal Terraforms, your Pulumis, your everything else's that you talk to today?
Isn't that just what like OVH and Ionos and all of them are doing? They've built products around open source technologies, and they try to give you the best way to easily use them. Is that not what a public cloud is?
Well, I don't know if they do give you the best way to easily use them, because a lot of them are a little bit janky to deploy to, and it is just a VM. I think almost what you have to do is take a really good platform as a service and productize that and build abstractions on top of the platform as a service. I mean, that's effectively what the large cloud providers are doing, right? So AWS built RDS. Could RDS have been some CloudFormation which deployed a really solid MySQL stack on top of EC2? Yes, because let's face it, that's what it is. But that's not what they sell you. They sell you, here is a really solid MySQL install, and here is a connection string to connect to it. They're almost doing that first layer of abstraction for you. And then you're not saying, I want an EC2 and I want MySQL on top of it, and I want it hardened in this way, and then I want you to give me a connection string. What you're doing is just give me a connection string. I want a database. And they do all of that really difficult stuff in the back end for you. So by the time you even get delivered that connection string, you're 3 layers of abstraction deep.
I think it's just like, it's a credible control plane story. It's probably another thing needed. Like OVH and Hetzner feel like very good hosting companies. And like to me, AWS feels like almost like a corporate insurance policy of like best in class, click a button platform, really. And until those hosting companies could come together to produce something similar, you're really going to struggle. You're going to be, as Gary said, to try to get anything out there, you're going to be 3 layers further deep than you would be on AWS. They're good hosting companies, but that layer on top is just missing.
And operationally, they're just not at that same level, right? Take the RDS example. it's not just the deployment of the database. It's the whole lifecycle management of that. The backups, the storage is rock solid. I know that if I click upgrade to the next version of MySQL, it is just going to happen because they are doing that millions of times a day. And that the likelihood of there being an issue is really low, but also that there are literally tens of thousands of support agents ready to troubleshoot it who do have access to the box. I don't think you get that just by having those two really solid layers of abstraction. That is a whole business model that's built up with years and years of expertise of doing this at scale. That, again, is a really hard thing to achieve if you are just a hosting provider.
Well, it's sort of where I wonder if that's the wrong place to innovate. You know, trying to bring together a whole bunch of little clouds is hard because collaborating is hard. And I wonder if perhaps you could turn this into a tooling or software problem. I mean, as an example, I'm not going to obsess over the tooling, but if you took a piece of lifecycle management tooling, you know, say something like a Juju and Charms, I know that those things are loaded, but if you were talking about something like that where the lifecycle management of the application is built into the code itself, and the substrate is either your Kubernetes platform or your virtual machine platform, and that's what the different, you know, little clouds are providing, and the investment instead goes into that lifecycle management, application modeling kind of platform or framework, then does that give you an opportunity to take the problems into pieces where you can invest heavily in, for example, a great Charm or whatever else for a serverless platform that then just deploys on standard Kubernetes, and then the competition happens, or the collaboration, depends how you look at it, happens at that Kubernetes layer where all a provider has to do is provide a CNCF certified Kubernetes platform that keeps resilient. And you've got separation there of your concerns. You provide something that's pretty standard as a standard cloud, and then you've got your software problem that sits on top where you've got your throat to choke there, for example, on whoever is providing that tooling around application management.
I think that it's a very idealistic view because what most teams value over everything else is that vertical integration. So unless you can fix that piece, I think this becomes a very difficult sell very quickly.
Yeah, I think if Europe, we'll say, was serious about something like that, they would need to have requirements around their procurement to say, we'll only procure on open standards. We're going to reject any vendor-locked APIs. Maybe like some sort of certified stacks that would have to be like approved, and that would have to go across providers, for example. I think that's what you're kind of talking about, Aaron. That's what they need to do, and that will be painful, and they need to accept that pain. And I don't think they're willing to, unfortunately. But I love the idea. I wish it was successful.
This episode is sponsored by HelloFresh. Nothing beats home cooking, and HelloFresh makes it easier to do more of it this year with recipes that are comforting, delicious, and enjoyable night after night. Bring everyone together with meals that are easy to make and satisfying, even on the busiest weeknights. Enjoy a choice of more than 100 recipes every week, from flavors around the world to meals that help beat the winter blues. Feel great with wholesome ingredients like sustainably sourced seafood and 100% antibiotic and hormone-free chicken. Impress guests or treat yourself with new grass-fed steak ribeyes and make meals with seasonal produce like pears, apples, and asparagus. When dinner tastes this good, nothing hits like home cooking. Sean tried HelloFresh and said it really took the stress out of planning dinner, and he loved the convenience of avoiding a trip to the supermarket. So go to hellofresh.com/HCS10FM to get 10 free meals and a freeze-willing knife, a $144.99 value on your third box. Offer valid while supplies last. Free meals applied at a discount on first box, and new subscribers only, varies by plan.
This is my personal opinion. I have nothing to back this, but I think if we took your idea and we actually implemented it, I think Shane has a point where at some point you just have to have the approved abstraction layer. And that's just going to have to talk to each individual cloud provider. And I think if you take it to a logical conclusion, you're just going to end up having one big AWS-like, maybe it's a different name, but AWS-like hyperscaler that's just federated between a bunch of different sites. I think that's what it's going to end up being versus a lot of little companies working together to provide a good experience. because I think Gary said, it's that vertical integration that people really value, and that's what the magic is. It's going to give you that perfect experience you're looking for.
I wonder how much that's true. I mean, I take the point. I just wondered, as I think of things like Azure Local, for example, where you've got the control plane being so valuable, but actually people are expanding back into their own hardware that's on OEM-provided machines that are not vertically integrated with Azure. They are local hardware, but people still use them because they want the control plane of Azure and they want to have the hardware they've procured from whichever OEM you're talking about, and they have that unified interface to do it. I mean, again, let's imagine you had a control plane that was invested in by the member states of the EU, and that control plane was all effectively operating like Azure Local, but your Azure Arc or whatever, it doesn't matter. But those things were effectively running on virtual machines or Kubernetes clusters that are spread across different providers, but you've got a unified control plane, and you say, oh, I want that to run on OVH, I want that to run on Hetzner or whatever. And then if that's unreliable for you, then you move those workloads to a different underlying VM provider or Kubernetes provider. But you've got a unified control plane that you can start developing an ecosystem of tools around.
This is my utopia, Aaron. I would love to get there. There's always the concern Europe will over-regulate and under-subsidize, though.
Pick your poison at this point, right?
Yeah. It's just like there's the idealized world, and then there's the competitive market, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, clearly I would like to see that all built on open source tooling because it's being bought with taxpayer money, et cetera, et cetera. And if you actually build open source projects around all the pieces of a good control plane to the extent those things don't already exist, then there's a chance you could do some good for society and maybe build ecosystems around some of these projects. But I agree, we're getting a little bit utopian at this point.
You run the risk of building a polite, expensive, compliant cloud that no one would use.
That's the most European thing I can think of. I don't know about you.
I'm really swinging here between utopia and just complete despair, to be honest with you.
Okay, so let's assume that Aaron's utopia is where we head. Who deals with all of the other bits that the cloud providers deal with currently? So networking, storage, DDoS protection, scaling out, all of that stuff. Like, okay, the cloud providers provide you the VM, but they also don't have networks that are at the scale of the hyperscalers, for example. They don't have NVMe storage to every single node like the hyperscalers. They don't have hypervisors with no realm zero, so that even the people that work for the company can't have access to the box.
Well, I think the answer to those questions comes through different pieces. You would need to have a robust marketplace like all the clouds have, where you would have people offering your ISV applications for things like DDoS protection or web application firewalls, those kinds of things, as those companies already do. And most of them are Kubernetes-based or whatever anyway. So
most of them are also American.
Sure, that's fine. I mean, at least you're choosing your poison, right? Like you've got to start somewhere. And if your problem goes from all of your infrastructure being based in the US to I buy from these suppliers that I trust for whatever reason, I agree that's still an opening into a US exposure, but it is at least, understanding and slowly narrowing your risk over time. I'm sure that if this became a thing, that there would be a European-owned web application firewall that would be an option if that was something people were prepared to pay for. But if you move down to the other pieces, like the hardware with, hypervisors that have got effectively Nitro architectures or whatever, that just becomes a quality of the underlying infrastructure provider that you're buying your VMs or your Kubernetes cluster from. So, some of them won't and they might be cheaper. Some of them will and they might be more expensive, but at least you're choosing those things as a separate layer in the same way you would buy hardware or whatever for your own data center. So it might not be quite so easy because you've got to choose instead of just choosing, just getting what you get. But if you look at the list of instance types on AWS, I'm not sure that's going to be, a million miles of complexity away from choosing between the existing instance types to choose between the options that you have in, I don't know, Frankfurt or whatever from different providers. On the other hand, networking is hard. Networking's the one that I'm looking at and I'm thinking that's a tough problem to solve across different providers.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I think some of our kind of wide open eyes utopia view of this is doing a lot of heavy lifting here, because I think when it comes down to the reality of I need to find another DDoS provider because provider A doesn't work with hosting company B, or I can't network effectively across these, or this company's uplinks are a bit rubbish and get congested from time to time, or I'm buying DDoS protection from a company that's in the US and is therefore doing the TLS termination, and it's a US-based company. Like all of these things that very quickly become problems, buying from a hyperscaler suddenly does become a lot more appealing, and just accepting the risk that that one hyperscaler might have a US parent company but says they won't do anything with it, honest gov, becomes maybe less of a risk profile than this new federated model.
Yeah, I can see that a model in this utopian world may well end up being that you effectively settle on one data center provider underneath, and that's who you use in nearly all cases, except maybe for your backups or for your DR or whatever, so that you simplify your kind of performance and network predictability in the same way that you might with, I don't know, regions or whatever in your hyperscalers.
If that's what it ends up being, that's okay. Because if all of a sudden Frankfurt starts getting really bad, then I can move my stuff over to Amsterdam and I have that freedom. I can migrate without giant egress costs or much disruption. At least you have that choice to easily migrate versus right now, there are no other options besides the one region for AWS.
I mean, you're right that that would make logical sense, but you also flag a potential challenge with this is that the underlying providers, in fact, would have costs in sending your data off to a different provider. So if, in your nice control plane, you said, move from this provider to this provider, and behind the scenes, if that's going from OVH to Hetzner or something, then actually it would be relatively legitimate for them to charge for that egress. So you would either need to solve that and say, look, this is part of being in the system that you can't, or alternatively, you then do have another piece of friction in the system.
You're right. It definitely is fair for them to charge. What I meant to say was you probably take that into consideration with your risk profile and understand this is the cost of moving, this is the cost of doing business. Where's the cost benefit analysis, right? To tell me at this point it makes sense to move. But you have the option.
I suspect that there would be a lot of political pieces to this as well. I mean, obviously it's a government initiative, but what I'm thinking is that once upon a time in my dark past, I ended up dealing with whatever that UK government marketplace thing is for providers. And, that's a system where you ease procurement and kind of government-related entities. And I can imagine that if something like this existed, then they might well make it easier for public entities within the EU to purchase services through this than to purchase it from the hyperscalers. And then again, the friction balance starts to get a little bit adjusted back in the direction of the EU kind of super cloud, whatever you want to call it.
Super cloud's a good name. I should use that.
You should tell AWS to rebrand to AWS Super Cloud versus Sovereign Cloud because that's not really sovereign.
Well, it doesn't sound like I'm getting my EU super cloud this Christmas. But we might leave this topic here and pick up the next one in 2 weeks' time. If you've got any questions, comments, or feedback, please do send them in to show@hybridcloudshow.com. We'll be back in 2 weeks. Until then, I've been Aaron.
I've been Gary.
I've been Sean.
I've been Shane.
See you later.